right, we begin with Nigeria. A breakdown of this year's budget of 21.8 trillion naira shows defense and security got the lion's share of 2.98 trillion. The budget has a deficit of 10.78 trillion naira. At the breakdown of the 2023 appropriation in Abuja, 8% of the revenue is expected from the oil sector, while the rest will be from the non-oil sector. The federal government also revealed that the incoming administration could inherit as much as 77 trillion naira in debt by the time President Buhari's tenure ends. Arise business and energy correspondent Oyin Sunday tells us more.
While the focus is usually on the total projected amount, current and recurrent expenditure, the place to look is the actual allocation to critical sectors of the economy, which gives a clear picture of what the budget really offers. Well, some might argue that the percentage allocated to the current and recurrent expenditure says all there is to say about the budget. So let's begin there. The 21.83 trillion naira budget with an oil price benchmark of $75 per barrel has a recurrent expenditure of 8.33 trillion naira. The capital expenditure of 6.46 trillion naira is 3% of the total expenditure and lower than the 3.5% recorded in 2022. At 6.3 trillion naira, debt service is 29% of total expenditure, 71% higher than the 2022 estimate, which includes interest payment of 1.2 trillion naira for the contested Ways and Means.
In terms of debt management, again, I'm sure the audience here is familiar with our medium-term debt management strategy, which has some fiscal sustainability measures, including that public debt as a percentage of GDP should not be more than 40%. Domestic and external debt ratio should be 70-30. So at public debt to GDP, we have 22.8%. This is as at 2022, but this has since moved on to 35.33%. Once we, this is as of September, once we adjust to the Ways and Means that has already been approved to be securitized. So once we bring it in, this will take us to 35.33%.
A look at the critical sectors show that defense and security gets the lion's share with 2.98 trillion naira, followed by education at 1.79 trillion naira. Infrastructure gets 1.24 trillion naira, while health gets 1.15 trillion naira. The overall budget deficit is 11.34 trillion naira for 2023. The budget's deficit is to be financed mainly by borrowings. 7 trillion naira will come from domestic sources, 1.76 trillion from foreign sources, 1.77 billion from multilateral and bilateral loan drawdowns, and 206.1 billion from privatization proceeds.
The gap between revenue and additional financing and total expenditure amounting to 553.46 billion is being expected to be financed by additional revenue from spectrum fees and also from tax from the maritime sector.
Total revenue available to fund the 2023 budget is estimated at 10.4 trillion naira. 63 government-owned enterprises are to provide 3.87 trillion naira. Oil revenue share is projected at 2.29 trillion naira. Non-oil taxes are estimated at 2.43 trillion naira, while federal government's independent revenues are projected to be 2.62 trillion naira. Other revenues totaling 7.62 billion naira is expected to fund the budget as well. In summary, 22% of projected revenue is expected from oil-related sources, while 78% is to be earned from non-oil sources.
Recurrent expenditures are broadly in 4 categories, the most significant one being personnel costs. The truth is, currently, there's not much that we can do to bring down the personnel costs. We have actually been managing our recurrent budget as tightly as we can. And what we have in our recurrent budget is largely non-discretionary, and we do not have much room to cut. And that's why we keep submitting that the real solution is in growing our revenues, so we have a greater capacity to to spend. It is because our revenues are so low that it looks like our expenditures are high.
The projected fiscal outcome in the 2023 budget is based on the PMS subsidy reform scenario, the concrete elephant in the room. In the 2023 budget framework, it is assumed that petrol subsidy will remain up to mid-2023 based on the 18-month extension. While this report is about numbers, the budget is much more. Beyond the figures, implementation matters most. Onyi Sunday, Arise News.
Joining us now to discuss further, we're happy to have Mr. Ben Akabueze, the Director General of the Budget Office of Nigeria. Good morning, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. There's so much to discuss, so we're glad to have you with us in the studio today. The Finance Minister, when she was talking about Nigeria no longer being a mono economy, talked about the contribution of non-oil and the oil sector, with oil falling to about 5.6%, non-oil looking at 94.3%. If we take a look at the revenues, though, I mean, I understand that's contribution to GDP. Can we make that that argument that Nigeria is well diversified in terms of revenues from your standpoint?
Well, I think the notion that she sought to dispel is the often repeated line that we are a mono-product economy, we're heavily dependent on oil. And when you want to measure the dominance of a particular sector in an economy, there are different parameters that you look at. You look at its contribution to domestic output. And that's the case she made. In terms of contribution to domestic output, oil is not that significant. When you look at, then you look at contribution to employment. When you look at its contribution to employment in this country, oil is small. That's why some people describe it as an enclave economy. I mean, very few people are really, at the end of the day, employed in that sector. Then you look at its contribution to government revenues. Again, that's what we're saying. She's saying that, look, oil has come from the days when it used to account for 70% of government's revenue to today, where for 2023, we're projecting a 22% contribution to budgeted revenues. But then, and she alluded to it, the other measure is then the contribution to export earnings, foreign exchange, and that's where oil remains dominant. Oil still accounts for over 70% of our foreign exchange earnings. And therefore, those of us on the fiscal side have now the burning challenge in terms of breaking the dominance of oil is to work with those in charge of trade policy and foreign and monetary policy to create a diversified base of foreign exchange earnings, and then we will finally break the chokehold that oil has had on our economy.
Speaking of which, looking at the revenue performance, I guess based on your answer, should we be, if we can have those figures, yeah, okay, so should the federal government's share of oil, 586 billion with respect to 2022. So how do you interpret this? Should we be alarmed it was that low, or encouraged that non-oil made up more of the revenue that came in? How should we break down these numbers?
Both.
Okay.
We should be alarmed that oil is, because at that 586 billion, that's only 35% of what we had projected, on a pro rata basis for it to contribute. So that's alarming. Okay, and therefore we must address the factors responsible for that, and it's principally, what you need to do: shore up production, deal with subsidy. These are the two factors that are eating away oil revenues. But we also then have to be encouraged by the fact that non-oil revenues are, for 2022, all came in above target.
Right. Yes. Okay. So both. That's fair enough. I want to, we played an excerpt right before we came to you, but I want to play it again on personnel costs, and you saying that it's going to be pretty tough to address that. So let's play that clip of you at the budget breakdown presentation.
Recurrent expenditures are broadly in 4 categories. The most significant one being personnel costs. The truth is, currently, there's not much that we can do to bring down the personnel costs. We have actually been managing our recurrent budget as tightly as we can, and what we have in our recurrent budget is largely non-discretionary, and we do not have much room to cut. And that's why we keep submitting that the real solution is in growing our revenues, so we have a greater capacity to to spend. It is because our revenues are so low that it looks like our expenditures are high.
Now, I know you are the Director General of the Budget Office, so I can't be asking you about laying off people and so on. But is that impossible? That there's nothing that can be done for personnel costs? Because for those numbers, you look at the expenditure performance of 2022. I think personnel costs for MDAs, Ministries of Partner Agency, was 3.2 trillion. But if you include pensions and government-owned enterprise, it comes to almost 4 trillion, 3.9. So, what do we do, sir, about these costs?
Well, I mean, if 3.9 sounds alarming to you, for 2023, we're looking at 5.2.
Wow.
Okay, so, but the point that I've made is this, okay? And I did, you only played a portion of what I said.
Yes.
I admitted that currently we probably have overstaffing in some areas and understaffing in other areas.
Okay.
And I cited the example of the police force,
right,
where we currently have about 300,000, and people think we should have at least double that number. And therefore, the government has made a decision that to retrench staff, even in the areas where we seem to have surplus currently, will exacerbate the socioeconomic situation. And therefore, what we have been doing over the years is a rebalancing of the numbers. So as people are being this attrition, retirements and other death and what, but in those areas where we're not replacing them. Instead, we are deploying that capacity that is freed up there to boost the numbers in the areas where we are short. So, for instance, the police has had an standing approval to add 10,000 personnel annually over the last 5 years. The same with the army, the different security agencies, because in those areas we are short. So the point that I was making is that even when you cut in those areas where you appear over, you need to deploy that to the areas where you are short.
Right.
So there's not going to be a net saving, the capacity for a net saving. And I argue that if you take the aggregate number of federal employees, including the military and security agencies, it's under 1.5 million. If you take that total number vis-a-vis our population and compare with global norms,
yes,
it's not a large number. The final point to make here is if you take even the 5.2 trillion projection for this year, divide by that 1.5 million people, you get less than 300,000 naira a month on the average.
Right.
Okay. For public, and that's across the entire, cadre of wrong of, so that's not a large number. Indeed, public, public sector employees are underpaid.
Got you. So you made that point when we had you in our Abuja studio when we had you then. Yeah.
Yes.
Can I pick your brain on the Oronsaye Report? There's a debate as to that. What's your? Can you shed some light? Do you agree that agency should be reduced, and how would that affect what you just talked about now in terms of balancing personnel and so on?
Absolutely. We in the Ministry of Finance, Budget and National Planning have remained fully supportive of implementation of the Oronsaye report, and there's ongoing work in that regard. It's taken, it's taken under different shades of views about that, but we think that it's needful and it aligns with this the point about the Oronsaye report is not, some people interpret it as cutting and chopping and laying off staff. Right. No, what you're talking about,
that club, unfortunately, so I'm wrong there. Okay.
Is that, look, there are agencies that seem to have, duplicated, mandates. So you collapse them, merge them. Of course, you'll have some savings. But those savings are likely to be at the level of folks like me, the top, the DGs. If you collapse, 3 agencies into one, 2 CEOs have no jobs.
Right,
but the rest of the people may have jobs. Just we've seen recently with the implementation of the PIA. Okay, we saw the former PPPRA and the former Petroleum Equalization Fund and the downstream sections of DPR come together into a single agency called the NPRA. But it didn't result in loss of jobs. If anything, they added numbers. So that's the kind of thing to assume that merging agencies necessarily will result in a massive saving of numbers isn't really.
Thank you for weighing in on that. So, debt service, I have to ask you about that. Based on the figures for 2022, I think 5.2 trillion debt service and then 6.5 trillion revenue. So debt service to revenue, 80%, sir. Do we hit the panic button on this figure?
Again, I mean, you'll be right to hit the panic button. Normally, when the debt service to revenue ratio for a country exceeds 30%, you need to start getting worried. So if at 80%, it's the thing. And indeed, we ourselves have hit the panic button. But the point is then, what do you do? Okay? And we submit that the debt service to revenue ratio is that high, not so much because the debt itself is too high, but rather because the revenue is too low, the denominator. And so if you affect the revenue, the revenue is the denominator, that ratio will drop. And that's what we are focused. That's what we are focused on as the sustainable solution. The easy solution is to cut the debt, cut spending and all of that. But trust me, the economy would be adversely impacted because it will mean that certain public services can't be delivered. It will mean, of course, for instance, that you will inevitably have to cut numbers and all of that. You won't be able to add to the numbers you're trying to add to the security agencies. You saw in your analysis of the budget, it's for this year's approximately 3 trillion naira for defense and security. Without security, everything else that you're trying to do basically falls apart. And so we must fix that problem. Imagine if we didn't have our current security challenges and we only had to spend saving 50% of that number. You will have a 1.5 trillion naira that's available to do other things. But this is our current reality. So we must keep our eyes on the ball, which is that, the revenue.
Gotcha. Now, speaking of revenue, revenue estimates for 2023 compared to actuals for 2022. So I have to ask you, so the 10.4 trillion for 2023 is the estimate, 6.5 up to November is what we brought in. Federal government share of oil revenue, I think the estimate is 2.29, but then as we just talked about, only brought in 586 billion. And non-oil, where we performed quite well, you're looking at 2.4 trillion, and then the actuals for November 2.09. Can we hope to raise revenue as you're looking at it overall? So your amount to focus on the 10.4 trillion when we did 6.5 so far. How do you think we can hit that number, sir? It sounds kind of lofty. Is what I'm trying to say.
If you look at those numbers, even if all we do is remain at the current run rate, we'll just top 7 trillion by the end of the year. But if you then take the fact that oil, look at that. If you had another 1.7 trillion naira on oil rather than where you are today, we will not be far from the target. Indeed, we'll practically hit the target for the goal for this year. And so when you look, first of all, on revenues, a lot of the revenues are ad valorem, charged on ad valorem basis, so they track inflation rate. So you'll expect, on the average, approximately. So just look at those comparisons, compare those numbers on an inflation-adjusted basis.
Yeah.
Then you see that the targets are not, it's not such a stretch. The key here, and I think that, I see a lot of the commentaries around this.
Yes.
People are trying to fault, this revenue projection, rather than, us having the right discussion, which is the fact that we see the oil that sector is letting us down in terms of revenues.
True.
What do we have to do? And there are two things that we have to do. We must get volumes back up there.
Yes.
Okay, and we must deal with the issue of, subsidy. Those are the two points eating away at oil revenues.
Yeah.
Look, 20 years ago when I was in banking, the projections were that by now Nigeria will be doing 4 million barrels per day of oil export.
Yes.
And the capacity existed if we had put the right policies, taken the right actions. If we had passed the Petroleum Industry Act 15 years ago, we would have caught the massive waves of global investment in the oil and gas sector that we missed out on. Today, imagine if we were pumping, 4 million barrels of crude oil per day instead of 1.
Right.
What difference it will make to our revenues? What difference it will make to our foreign exchange situation? And by extension, what difference it will make to domestic output that has been somewhat constrained by challenges with access to foreign exchange. So these are the discussions that I like us to have, and really about this, rather than people trying to speak. We don't just put these numbers out, without any sense of thing. And some of people, it's just that once you start working for government, everybody thinks you are now nitwit. You can't listen. But I think people should give some credit to the folks who sit back and work on these. People don't just wake up from sleep and put these numbers out. And a budget has to be aspirational. You don't wake up and say, okay, because last year I failed, so next year I should plan to fail. That's not how budgets are done.
Understood. All right. Of course, we're speaking with Mr. Ben Akabueze, the Director General of the Budget Office here on the Global Business Report. I just want to, we're going to take a quick break, but I want to put up these, I'm sorry to take you through this, but I have to ask you. So the expenditure side.
I mean, that's why
we're here, right? So the expenditure side, just to have the same conversation we just had on revenue. So that's total expenditure. We've got recurrence, 21.8, then the actuals, 12.8. Recurrent, I want to get your thoughts on this after the break. 8.3, 10.2 is the actual, then capitals, particularly capital expenditure, and then I guess the debt service and budget office. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be right back with our exclusive conversation with the Director General of the Budget Office, Mr. Ben Akabueze. It's the Global Business Report. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Global Business Report here on Arise News. We'll continue our exclusive conversation with the Director General of the Budget Office, Mr. Ben Akabueze. Thank you so much for sticking around with us, sir. So yes, I guess right before we went to break, we're looking at those expenditure figures. I guess, I want to pick your brain on this, because recurrent, for example, you look at where revenues are, if you can speak to that, and then even the capital expenditure, we really significantly underperformed there. So can you give your thoughts on how, one can expect to improve on these going into the new budget year?
Well, first of all, I think that the number you have there for recurrent, that
as far as the estimate, 8.3,
that you're comparing with the 2023 projection, is a number that already includes the debt service.
Okay.
That your 10.2 already includes the 5.2 of debt service, so it's not the right number to compare with that. But in terms of this year, and I'll admit, unfortunately, that is the case. Our capital expenditure this year has been constrained by two factors. First, the overall shortfall in revenue. And as I said, because most of our recurrent spending currently is non-discretionary. We've got to pay folks. We've got to meet debt service obligations between the two. They mostly account for your recurrent spending. Therefore, capital expenditure tends to take that. And then the portion of our borrowings this year, in terms of our plan for borrowings, which for the domestic debt, DMO fully down on that. But our foreign borrowing component this year had to be stepped down because the markets, the international capital markets were not attractive. And so that portion, which will have gone into funding capital expenditure, didn't come in. So that's part of why you saw, capital spending, fall that low relative to the target for the year. But again, it's part of why the capital budget for the year for 2022 has been extended up to March next year. So we expect that by the time the spending under the 2022 capital budget closes, we will see a better performance.
Thank you for that. The Finance Act, of course, we know that that's yet to be signed. Are we confident that the president will sign it this week, or what's the, I know it's up to you. I mean, he has to sign it, but what's the timeline you expect on the Finance Act being signed?
I'll be reticent to put a timeline now because the truth is, as the Honorable Minister indicated yesterday, normally when a bill is passed by the National Assembly, it's sent to different of government to look at and advise Mr. President. And there are, so that process is ongoing, and there are some reservations that some will have about some of the clauses in the bill as passed currently. So a decision will be made finally as to whether or not those reservations weigh efficiently enough for Mr. President to request the National Assembly to take another look at them, or whether there are things that the executive can live with, and then in which case he will go ahead and sign. But that's a decision that, to the best of my knowledge, has not been made. So I think it's premature to start talking about time.
Gotcha. All right, fair enough. Last time we had you in our Abuja studio, we had a fair discussion on taxes, and still on the Finance Act. There's been, and of course it's a bill, it has not been signed, as you've already clearly said. So, but some of the clauses, as you said, because caused some pushback. I want you to take a listen to Dr. Muda Yusuf, the head of the Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise. We had him on to talk about this, and I want you to take a listen to his comments and get your reaction.
The finance bill, something very disturbing happened. Now, for such an important bill, because the bill is imposing 0.5% levy on all imports coming from outside of Africa. The bill is now, as we have seen, has moved tertiary education tax rates
2%, right?
From 2.5% to 3%.
3%, right? Yeah.
Then there are also issues about excise duty, excise tax on a wide range of services. These are fundamental changes that can change.
But Dr. Yusuf, we need revenue. So
we need revenue.
We need the money.
Yes, we need the money, but you cannot overtax investment.
Okay.
Go to other clients.
Okay.
Corporate tax in Nigeria is one of the highest. The global average of corporate tax is around 27%. Go to Europe, go to all these advanced economies that we aspire to be like. They don't have any country where corporate tax is as high as 30%. So in addition to this 30%, you now have this 3% tertiary education tax. You have something for police trust fund, also on companies. You have something for the NITDA, 1%. You have something for national engineering, something and technology, another 1%. If you pipe too much pressure on investment,
drive it away.
You drive them away, and the economy cannot recover.
Yeah. Sir, your reaction to that? What's your take? Dr. Yusuf sounded very passionate about that, so I want to get your reaction.
Well, I mean, I've listened to my good friend Muda Yusuf, but while he is right to be concerned, and philosophically I do agree with him, that you don't want to overburden investors with taxation. But I think that the situation is not as dire as he makes out. So on corporate tax, for instance, when you start talking about global averages, you're simply there are countries where corporate tax is zero.
Right.
Because, by their own strategy, you have all this what they call tax havens and different, reasons. So when you talk about global average, you're throwing all of those into the mix. Okay. And then when he says that in Europe, there's people that don't have corporate tax as high as 30%. Actually, even in Germany, corporate tax is 29.8, and between 29.8 and 30, there's really no difference. So I think what is more useful rather than global average is to pick our comparator, countries and try and compare. And the truth is, when you compare with, us, our corporate tax rate to our comparator countries, 30% is not that high. But I do share his concern about this trend now of, adding, even if it's 0. whatever, 0.11, through, it's of different agencies. And what is happening is that because of the overall constraint in terms of accessing funds from the budget, agencies, as they push for their enactment, people are, trying to sort of, get, ring-fence some pool of revenue that is not, subject to the rigorous process of accessing funds from the budget. So from a policy standpoint, as Director General Budget Office of the Federation, I have much reservations to that approach, and we've made that clear that it's best to bring all of this into a pool, and we have a rigorous process for accessing, prioritizing, and giving access to the pool of funds. And it also helps with tax administration. Oftentimes Nigeria is criticized. People talk about multiple taxation, but in reality, the problem is more with our tax administration. The example that I often cite is when you take, in the US, for instance, if you get a property tax bill, there could be 10 different charges or taxes embedded in that single bill. But you get a single bill called property tax, and you pay to one agency, and that agency takes responsibility for distributing to all the other. Here, sometimes you might get, it's from 10 different agencies, so it looks like there's a multiplicity. So again, when you start creating all of these levies and whatever in the laws, setting up different agencies, you compound the problem of tax administration. But when you talk about the tax, you've got to look at it in totality. So if Yusuf isolates corporate tax rate, and you should also take VAT rate and compare across board, and you find that Nigeria is down, it's the lowest, even below 50% of the average for Africa. And when it talks about excise, if you compare, you will find that Nigeria is also below, and that's why there's been some efforts to try and look, until maybe like over 10 years ago, there used to be excise applicable on a wide range of goods. Indeed, that law wasn't repealed. It was by an administrative process that excise was narrowed down to alcohol and tobacco. That law wasn't ever repealed. And so government thinks it's time now to reopen the excise to the other aspects of goods and services that had always been excisable.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for that. Subsidies. This was another big thing that we talked about when we had you in Abuja. Fuel subsidy provision for this budget ends, I think it's extended to, about June, 3.3 trillion or so. Now, I know, of course, the government would have left by that time, so whatever happens after that is the problem of the new administration. But if fuel subsidies are extended beyond June, because then the new administration will just be coming in May, and then a month later they will be thinking about removing subsidies, which sounds a bit complex. But if this isn't extended, is it obvious that 3.3 trillion then obviously goes up?
Well, that's what it will mean. I mean, when we initially cut the 2022 budget, at that time, the plan was for subsidy to go by mid-2022.
Right.
And so we only had 443 billion naira provided for subsidy. But at the beginning of 2022, a decision was taken to extend the subsidy for another 18 months because of all the pressures that came from Russia-Ukraine war, inflation spiked, and all of that. Government said, look, let's pace this out, and we had to go back to the drawing board, and so we revised the subsidy projection for 2022 from 443 billion to 4 trillion naira.
Wow. Yeah.
So if a decision is taken to extend it, we will have to go back to the drawing board again.
Gotcha. I really want to pick your brain on this. Our correspondent in Bayelsa, Ovieteme George, shared a report on the fuel queues in Bayelsa, in Yanago, I believe. And I really want you to listen to this. We took an excerpt. There were 3 individuals who complained about the fact that fuel was selling for about 400 or 500 in some areas of Bayelsa. So they were going to a queue where it was selling for 170. And what I want to get your thoughts on is on whether Nigerians are mentally prepared for a subsidy removal and mentally prepared to pay higher money for. So let's take a listen to those 3 gentlemen.
Sometimes we have to buy 400, 500, which is very bad. We don't have that kind of money to spend.
I buy it because here is more cheaper. Other places they are selling 350, 400.
I decided to come and suffer here because the fuel here is cheaper. Other places are selling 450, 500.
All right, so those are the 3 individuals. So, Director General, you've expressed your thoughts on fuel subsidy, but is the message, is it permeating, is it reaching the average Nigerian based on what you've heard from those 3 men in Bayelsa?
Well, I don't think so. And truth is, it's only natural. If there's a place where you can still get it for 170, you don't want to be paying 450, 500. But if at the end of the day, everywhere it's sold for 500,
then you don't have a choice.
Then you really don't, what you will then mentally begin to adjust for. But to the notion that it could be, and I think what is happening is rather unfortunate and disorderly, because that whole gap between 170 and 450 or whatever, that unfortunately for us none of that is getting to us.
Right.
Because since officially this subsidy hasn't been removed, the products are still being sold ex depot at the regulated price.
So is it then a communication task for government to be able to tell Nigerians, like those men there, that listen, this is what fuel is going to sell for if we remove it? Should there be some kind of awareness campaign where you explain to people explicitly that this is what you should be paying if fuel is removed? Because that's the thing here. It doesn't seem like that message is getting through because people still expect to pay for cheap fuel.
I do agree that once a firm decision is made to pull the subsidy, whether on a phased or single shot basis, it has to be supported by massive public awareness campaign.
I don't know if this is a fair comparison. I want to get your thoughts. Calculating Nigeria's budget in dollar terms, looking at our population. So we took the 21 trillion and we divided by the I&E rate of 416. We got 45 billion. We then converted at the parallel market rate of 740 and you get 20. Now, I know, of course, the budget, of course, has its own parameters, but looking at our population, sir, there's the argument that this money isn't enough and it's got to be much higher.
It's not even an argument. Right. There should be no argument about it.
Yeah.
And we're always first to admit it. And that's why we keep saying that our challenge is not that government is spending too much, but actually that government is spending too little.
Right.
And so the discussion should be, how can we enable government to spend more? Okay? And so that's why, and these numbers you've drawn, this is with the high deficit that people are quarreling about.
Right.
So imagine if you took that out what it will be. We will simply not be able to hold this system together. Everything will apart. So, I mean, this kind of numbers, these are numbers for, I mean, that you think you're discussing the New York fire department's budget or whatever is there, or some top university like Harvard's budget. So that's our reality. But again, the truth is that if you wanted to do this sort of number, the thing will be to use the purchasing power parity basis for determining the dollar number. But even then, whichever way you cut and slice it, we're not spending enough. And the number in terms of our public expenditure to GDP, we're about the lowest in the world, very low. So it's a settled matter that all of governments, and I'm talking here when I talk about Nigeria's public expenditure to GDP, I'm talking about adding what the federal is spending, the state and the local governments. It's still a low number, and that's why public goods and services are suffering, and people expect the same level of provision of public goods and services that they have in some, but you've got to look at those numbers. How much in terms of resources are available to government to do this vis-a-vis the population? But what that also speaks to is that inevitably we must have a discussion around population policy.
So that's also trying to, as far as the population growth and so on and so forth. How should the average Nigerian interpret this budget? If the common person on the street was to ask you, Mr. Akabueze, what does this mean for me? What would you say they should interpret this?
Well, this budget attempts to address within the limits of the fiscal constraints that we face. The challenges that the average Nigerian faces, whether it's challenge of infrastructure, moving goods from one point to another, and so you see resources allocated to that, to road and transport sector. This budget aims to improve delivery of social services, whether it's in the health or education sector, and so that's why you see resources allocated there. And oftentimes, when people evaluate the budget, there's a straight capital expenditure, recurrent expenditure divide, and there's this notion that all capital expenditure is good and all recurrent expenditure is bad, which is not correct.
Gotcha.
Because when it comes to social services, whether it's in health or education, the bulk of the expenditure invariably is recurrent. You've got to pay the teachers, you've got to pay health workers. But guess what? Empirical studies show that investment in those sectors, even though they're recurrent in nature, that they yield greater benefit. In terms that there are methods of computing this, I won't bore you with this, but they actually deliver greater return on investment to countries. So whenever we just do this, see how much they're spending on capital, see how much on recurrent, it's not that straightforward. So the way we put it is some recurrent spending is good.
Right.
And some is bad.
Even like debt. Some debt is good if you are reinvesting that debt.
So that's what. So for the average Nigerian, you should expect to see. But there's all the average Nigerian. Well, in this case, actually not the average, but the below average, because the social investment program isn't really targeted as the average Nigerian.
Right.
But really at the people at the bottom of the pyramid. There's 809 billion naira in the 2023 budget to fund all of these social investment programs, targeted at, unemployed youth, and to get them something to do in the interim and some stipend, the conditional cash transfers for the really, poor, old and vulnerable, and the school feeding programs and things like that. So that's this. Really, it's the wealthy half of the country are the ones who should really be, asking what is in this budget for us.
Right. I get you, sir. Final question for you, sir. What's your outlook for the economy? I mean, it's still early in the year. There's so much going on. 2023, such a pivotal year. How do you see the economy of Nigeria, I guess, playing out for this fiscal year?
Well, from where I sit, I cannot but be optimistic. I mean, we see the headwinds, but our job is to try and swim against the tide, to try and manage the impact of those. And we've got to keep alive. We've got to put a courageous and optimistic face to tackling these challenges. And I expect that in the course of the year, inflation will taper down, because inflation really hurts the poor. As they say, inflation is a tax on the poor, and if inflation is sustained at this rate, it will only compound the problem of poverty. So we've got to deal with that. Basically we must address the problem of getting the volumes, getting numbers up in our oil sector, for a number of reasons. One, apart from the positive impact on government revenues, the foreign exchange. It's because we're not overnight going to be able to affect its significance in terms of being a major source of foreign exchange earnings. But I expect that as we begin to walk through, we have the new NNPC now as the drive, the PIA implementation, all of the reforms in the oil and gas sector, for us to see some investment flowing into that sector, which remains one of the most attractive sectors in terms of foreign investment into the country, because we need help from outside. We need this, we need a lot of investment, and that includes not just domestic, but a lot coming from outside. Yeah. So I think that all in all, I expect 2023 to be better for us than 2022.
We'll leave it at that. On a positive note, the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation, Mr. Ben Akabueze, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, Roger. It's my pleasure.